Alrighty, I'm here with State Representative Keith Goehner from the 12th District. Hi, Mr. Goehner. It's great to be speaking with you today. Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate the opportunity to visit.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So yeah, just an introduction to how this will go. I have a few questions laid out for you, but really, I just want to know kind of your personality, your beliefs, your background. And so hopefully it's more of a conversation than an interview. But of course, to start us off, I'm curious, how'd you end up calling the 12th District your home? What's your backstory in that sense?
Well, I was born and raised here in the Dryden area. Actually, I was born in Leavenworth and grew up through college here, and then went to Seattle Pacific, Wenatchee Valley College for 2 years, and then Seattle Pacific got my degree. And after that, I taught school in Moses Lake. And my wife and I were married when I was out, just graduated from college. And then after teaching school there in Moses Lake, we kind of felt the call to the valley where our families were, and there was an opportunity to come back and farm, which is something that I thought I would never do, because as a kid growing up, I was working in the orchard all the time, and I said, no, I want to do something else. But really, from a different perspective, from a more, adult look at it, it was very attractive lifestyle to raise your family with. Little did I know how unpredictable our income would be, but that's the nature of farming. So we've been here the rest of our lives. And shortly after coming back to the Valley, I was elected to the R-Dryden School Board. So I served on the board. And then, I've been involved in community activities, different organizations, very active in our church. And then, I became, aware that we needed a representative on the Chelan County Commission that, shared my values. And so I ran for office there and served 16 years as a commissioner. And then when I thought I was going to be done with public service, the opportunity came to serve in the legislature. And so 2 years ago, I ran for the seat. And of course, I've served for the last 2 years. So that's kind of a brief overview, but that's kind of how I got to where I am today. I guess my wife and I, we've been married for 47 years. We have 3 married children, 6 grandkids, and we're very fortunate to have 4 of those grandkids live here on our family orchard, and we have expanded our orchard land and continue to work to be the best we can as growers, and so that's kind of where we're at.
Fantastic! Congratulations on all that success you found in the orcharding business. I'm curious, can you just describe maybe in a few sentences the 12th district? It's a relatively large district, and it encompasses a pretty diverse array of geographical land and such. So I'm curious how you describe the district right now.
Well, the district, just generally speaking, is a very rural district,
right?
Compared to some of the districts on the west side where they're very urban, and you can almost literally see from a vantage point your whole district. This district, the 12th district, has about 9,000 square miles. It's Chelan, Douglas, part of Okanagan, and part of Grant County. So it goes from Stevens and Blewett passes clear to Grand Coulee Dam to the Canadian border. So you can see geographically it's very spread out, and but as I mentioned, it's mainly rural. In the Chelan and Douglas areas, it's primarily agriculture. Okanagan is too. It's kind of a different agriculture. That's where you'll find cattle ranching, which isn't so much in particularly in Chelan County. There is some cattle ranching in Douglas County and wheat growing. So there's a variety of agricultural interests, and that's probably the largest single sector of business. But then there's tourism, which is continues to grow, and then we have a number of other businesses that provide employment and but one of the things that is really has grown considerably, as I mentioned, with the tourism industry, is the outdoor recreation. We used to have the draw of Leavenworth and Lake Chelan. And I know when I was younger and we'd go up into the high lakes and, hiking and camping, there'd be very few people. And now when you go to some of the more popular spots, I mean, there's no place to park. It's literally overrun. And so in some of the areas where you have permit issues, that's a real challenge to make sure that we preserve the natural beauty and yet create the opportunities for people to come and recreate and enjoy what we have right in our backyard.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was up at backpacking in the Enchantments this summer, and it was like a highway. It was incredibly busy. And so I guess I'm curious to jump off that point, like you mentioned, kind of balancing those two, the promoting, local economy and tourism and such, and also balancing that with protecting our lands. What are some, I don't know, maybe policies or decisions you made either as a commissioner or currently as a state legislator to kind of balance those two sometimes competing forces?
Well, in the last 2 years, we really haven't had too many issues at the state level where we've dealt with natural resource issues. It's a real ongoing challenge to provide enough funding for maintaining and protecting, what we have. And so, it's something that is very much in the forefront of my thinking as it relates to outdoor, recreation. As a commissioner, I worked along with the Forest Service to develop some areas, from the county perspective. And I think that, what we were trying to do is create more opportunities for people to, enjoy the outdoors in a responsible manner. So there were specific projects that we worked on. I know, like with the Stability Partnership, that was to preserve and also allow for the different activities, whether it be snowmobilers, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. I mean, just to integrate different interests, make sure that everyone's got a voice at the table, and that when we come up with a plan to roll out public use plans, that it does reflect the different interests, which is a wide variety of interest groups.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jumping off that point in talking about land use and stuff like that, we just encountered some pretty devastating fires in the area and in the state broadly. I'm curious what kind of policies you might advocate for in terms of fire management and mitigation techniques to ensure that those things happen as infrequently as possible.
Well, this would have been, had we not had the brush fires, the wildland fires there in September, this would have been the second year where we would have been relatively without much of an issue with fires. We had a few isolated ones that were still significant, but it wasn't like we've had in years past. So I was pretty, feeling pretty good that, hoping anyway, that we would be getting into a little, damper conditions, higher humidities in September, but that wasn't the case, and there was some real devastation. So what it did point out is that, we have so many, whether they be open rangeland or, forested lands, that we don't really consider the fuel break aspect of it. So, we talk about forest health management, reducing the fuel loads in the forests. We have a lot of infected, bug infested stands that when fire goes there, it burns with tremendous intensity, which tends to sterilize the soil, which makes it more difficult for regrowth. So, I mean, there's a number of factors, a number of different elements that should be addressed. And the unfortunate thing is that in some ways, as a public, we get in the way of our own planning process. I know that the Forest Service, the North Central Washington Forest Collaborative, have been working on a 70,000 acre project, the Wenatchee project, that would allow for the thinning of the forests and cleaning up the fuel loads. But the permitting process with the National Environmental Protection Act and the State Environmental Protection Act, which are, were well-meaning, but they tend to stand in the way just because of the time that it takes to go through there. It stands in the way of some of the activities that could happen that would minimize some of the very things that help create the intense burned forest. So For me, I've always been, for the whole time I was a county commissioner, I was trying to get more activity in the forest as far as, the timber products industry, where we could get, some of that wood and some of the vegetation cared for to minimize, keep the fires lower, less intense. And that can be very positive. We've seen in years gone by where, that was used in a very prescriptive manner that allowed for a healthier forest. But I think that, when I mentioned about the public getting in the way, the other thing is when the Forest Service or DNR wants to do prescriptive burning to reduce some of these fuel loads, oftentimes, the air quality, concerns keep the fires from actually happening, that management tool. So in some ways, I think we have to recognize there are trade-offs. And I know that and Dr. Paul Hesburgh has mentioned, how do you want your smoke? Do you want it in huge doses with the big intense fires, or would you like it in smaller increments where you can actually manage it and use it as an effective proactive tool?
Right. You mentioned something there that I'm curious about, and then I think maybe people watching this might be curious about. You mentioned kind of logging and the timber industry. I'm not someone who's familiar with that at all, and so you mentioned some positive benefits of that, and I was wondering if you could kind of expand on some of those positive benefits, and also touch on, I'm sure there might be people that question, any net negative that could come out of logging, whether it's getting carried away or property rights being risked, or obviously harm of the environment. I'm curious, you mentioned the positive aspects, so maybe delineating that a little bit.
Well, when you talk about timber harvest, I mean, it should be done in a very selective manner. And I think we've learned lessons. We always talk about best available science. Well, at one time, the best available science was the most embraced science was the clear cut, for example. And that is the one thing that gives them, you get the most pushback on. And I understand that. And then what also happened was that when we replanted with a single species, which was not the natural growth. So if we get into the forest and management in a way where we are selectively logging or harvesting, we actually can take out, trees that are ready to be, extracted. We can convert them into good wood products, which everyone enjoys and purchases. And as I mentioned, we can be reducing those fuel loads in the forest. Now, younger, healthier trees, create a tremendous carbon sink. And, as you thin out your forests, your trees are healthier because they get more sunlight. The forest floor, gets more sunlight. So, I mean, there is a management tool there that really is a very positive from the environmental standpoint. I like to think about it as a win-win-win, where we actually end up with an economic component where communities do have a timber industry that can employ people, produce products, for others. We end up with a much healthier forest for the trees themselves, and as I mentioned, the carbon sink. And then we also create habitat for both wildlife and also the terrestrial and then the aquatic aspects of it. So given those things, and if we can put them together in a meaningful conversation where people can understand those benefits, I like to think that those things could be moving forward. There's right now a court case where the Wilderness Society and I think there's another environmental type group that were actually embracing this very concept, and they're being challenged. So once again, if you have public groups, public interest groups that don't want to see any activity in the forest, it ends up being a counterproductive thing. So we do have a wide variety of interests that are understanding that how important it is to manage the forest, reduce the density of the stands, and it is a beneficial component to many different variety of interests in actually, as I mentioned, the habitat and the communities. The other thing that is a really key thing, back in the days of even Teddy Roosevelt, when we put together we had the timber lands where you actually had federal tax timber revenues came off those lands that were next to rural communities, and that's what was funding the schools. But Teddy Roosevelt even mentioned how these communities are the ones that were taking, they were the stewards of the forests in their backyard. And that really was often the case, where the guys who were working in the forest were the first responders to fires. They were the ones that cared the most because their livelihood depended on a well-managed forest. So, we have shown in the past where we can do both. I mean, reduce the fuel loads.
So we did get disconnected briefly, but we're back on. Representative Goehner, you were talking about that court case and kind of the implications it might have.
Well, I think there's tremendous significance there because, the Wilderness Society has been typically in the past, resistant to timber harvest activities. They actually are supporting this because there was a plan in place. And as I mentioned before, it takes extensive vetting to get a plan approved. And they were supporting it, and yet, they have been challenged in court. And so I think it's, as I said, I think we have more of a consensus of what really is beneficial for the forest and for the environment and for the economic piece of the communities. The one thing that we have lost, though, that is a challenge, but I also know that there are groups that are working diligently to try and kind of put together an infrastructure where the mills would be closer to the forest. And right now, that's what is also standing in the way of some of these timber stands not even being bid on for removal of the wood.
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining that. I certainly didn't know much about that, but it's great to learn and kind of know where your thoughts lie in that case. So I want to kind of move, take a step back a little bit and talk about something that I'm sure you've been discussing all campaign season and has obviously impacted your campaign. And that's the coronavirus pandemic that we're currently in. First of all, I guess I'm curious, how has COVID affected the 12th district specifically?
Well, initially it was very impactful because most commercial activity was shut down. As you know, we had the essential, non-essential lists that were there. So we had a lot of the bigger box stores being able to be open, but the smaller stores were not. And that was unfortunately, the smaller stores, they don't have much behind them financially. I mean, they're on their own. And some of the bigger corporate stores, whether it be the Home Depots, the Walmarts, I mean, they certainly have a totally different economic model. And so for the 12th district, which is comprised of a plethora of small businesses, they were being impacted significantly. We even still today, 8 months later, still have businesses that, for whatever reason, whether it be a restaurant, whether it be a hotelier, that have not been able to, felt like it made sense for them to open. And so, we continue to work to try and get a better, I guess, a delineation as to what is, behavior that presents a risk. Even today, we were talking with the health officials about, we here in the 12th district, we have, most of us are in like a 1.5, the county, I know that Okanagan County is in a 2.0, which allows them more flexibility than we have in Chelan and Douglas counties. And so, we're hopeful that we can get some of these opportunities to also, be open, and so that people have the opportunity to do business. Typically, a small business person, when they put their business plan together, they make projections as to what their revenues would be, what their overhead is. And when you artificially and arbitrarily determine that you can only, cap your revenues at 25% of what you would like to, it doesn't cap your overhead at 25%. If you have rent, or a mortgage, or your supplies, all of those things are still, at 100%. So, it's really critical to let the, businesses be able to experience some success in line with the safety protocols that need to be in place. And each business does have to have a safety plan in place in order to open for a business.
Right. And so that kind of goes into what my next question was going to be, which is kind of where do your opinions differ from what is currently the law of the land, the policies that have been implemented, which you kind of answered there. So I'm curious, I guess, I guess what, you're talking about allowing businesses to further reopening, to further reopen. What are kind of the guidelines that you would want businesses to follow in that case when, if they're given more freedom? You talked about following safety guidelines, but I guess maybe if you could be a little more specific than that. What would you want those businesses to be following? What metrics would you want them to be, meeting? Stuff like that.
Well, I think the one consistent thing that is somewhat universal is masking and social distancing. I mean, that's about the best we have at this point. I mean, when you talk to the healthcare professionals, we don't have a vaccine, at this juncture. So, if the businesses, require masks and 6 foot spacing, I mean, that seems to be the accepted practice. And, if they do, and I most businesses do, they've got, things marked, they've got them, chained off so that you're not interacting with too many of the patrons. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we talk about when, as far as safety protocols to ensure to the best of our ability that, we're minimizing the opportunity for transmission. So, I mean, that's why I think that, when you look at some of the businesses that were on an okay list, and even each week it seems like the governor is allowing more and more, but it's typically in the phase 2 and above counties. And that's where, Chelan and Douglas County, which is the bulk of the 12th district, are being impacted because of that 1.5 designation. And that really is somewhat confining as far as the actual percentage of business they can do.
Right. Interesting. Sounds good. So talking a little bit about kind of some of the demographic information in the 12th district, I was kind of just taking a look in anticipation of this conversation. And specifically something that pointed out, that kind of struck me was, I noticed that Okanagan County has, according to the latest census numbers, has a much higher rate of poverty than other counties nationally, other places nationally. Chelan and Douglas counties fall right about at the average line. And so obviously I think that poses a problem, right? Like, especially a financial problem. And I think, for any elected official, that's an issue of, right, like, you spend more money, do you allocate more money to places that are experiencing higher rates of poverty, like Okanagan County, or do you seek to reallocate funds that are already existing? And I think that's an issue that's at the heart of this election, at the heart of this race, is kind of balancing or kind of the role that the state budget has in kind of allocating money to rural communities in Eastern Washington and Central Washington. And I'm curious where you stand on that. Would you support expanding the state budget to maybe provide more financial relief or economic relief to communities in Okanagan County, for example, that are impacted by these higher rates of poverty? Or would you feel more comfortable maybe reallocating the money that is currently, kind of allocated for in the budget?
Well, from my political philosophy and as a farmer, I know what it is to you take risks, you make choices in life, and you go from there. But what I really am concerned about is that people have that opportunity for success, and it should be across the board. They do have employment opportunities to choose from that would fulfill and allow them to feed their families and put a roof over their heads and have discretionary income. So to me, it isn't either or. I think sometimes you have to have the safety nets, of course, but the more long-term solution that really is most beneficial is building the economy in such a way that within the communities you have good paying jobs. As I mentioned, as people are gainfully employed, there's so much more satisfaction of life. The people that are just hanging on and just get from paycheck to paycheck, or not paycheck, but I mean benefit check to benefit check. I know that they would much rather have a job that would give them some satisfaction and allow them the opportunity to explore more in life, in a sense, even with the talents and abilities and skills that they may not even have an opportunity to perfect. So if we're looking at some of these areas that are lower, I mean, that's where I think it's important to provide incentives for businesses to locate, to become somewhat of a magnet, I guess, because you would have a workforce there. You would allow people, to be, employed. It would allow a business to prosper, and then the community would be able to grow and be more vibrant. So it needs to be an integrated approach. As I said, the safety nets, we certainly need to take care of those among us that are not able to. But for those that are and want to, we certainly need to be creating more employment opportunities so that we can have economic development within those communities that most need it.
Right. Okay. So I think the question, from there is, how do you create those employment opportunities? And it is kind of a lack of job opportunity. Is that kind of something that you might attribute that higher poverty rate in Okanagan County to?
Well, when you go to and talk with business owners in Okanagan County, in fact, just recently, I'm hearing that there will be more businesses actually closing. So
right.
We need to really look at what is it that's keeping these people from keeping their business alive. Now, I mentioned earlier about the timber industry. That used to be a major employer for the area, in Okanagan County. And when you have a strong industry, it has, ancillary benefits. And so, if we look at, well, what is it that's keeping, something from happening? What can we do to attract other businesses? I mean, it's an ongoing issue. But I think that's one that we can never, give up on, because, we do want people to be able to, enjoy the location that they're in. I mean, you can always, encourage people to relocate to areas where there are more jobs. But, if this is where home is, I mean, it's difficult to do sometimes. But that's why, if we can work diligently, provide incentives for businesses to locate in some of these areas, which is happening. I mean, we have the opportunity zones that have been created that will stimulate more business activity. But it is a longer term process. So, I guess for some of those people, as I said, I think we need to have that safety net. We have to look at it in a way that doesn't, keep people on that cycle, because they'd much rather, as I said, be employed and finding fulfillment in their daily life by going to work.
Interesting. Fantastic. All right, so we just have a few more minutes left. I don't want to take too much of your time today, but I just had a couple of very quick questions. First of all, I think political polarization is something that's a bit, more broadly expansive in terms of, existing throughout society, American society. I think, more and more people are trusting the media less. They're experiencing political polarization. Be that within their families, on Facebook, and stuff like that. I guess I'm curious, as someone who is an elected official in the state of Washington, in the Washington House of Representatives, is that something that you've experienced, that political polarization?
Yes, and it's something that for me personally, I've never felt that there was any productivity involved there. Because my approach to governing is to try and understand people who do not agree with me, rather than just summarily write them off. Because if somebody doesn't agree with me, they obviously have a different perspective, and I want to make sure that where I'm coming from really has analyzed all aspects of it. When they talk about like a car accident or something, you got 6 witnesses and they got 6 different stories. Well, it's still the event still happened. And that's where, when we have problems that we're trying to address, we need to make sure that we, I do anyway, as a representative, that I really listen carefully to different perspectives, factor it in my decision. At some point, then I do need to make a decision, provide the leadership in that regard. But polarization, to just summarily write people off and not engage because they're just from one side or another, a different perspective, to me is not it's very counterproductive, and it's detrimental and destructive to our society, because of the how it breaks down relationships and makes it difficult for us to even coexist here in society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Final question that I have before I let you go is talking about the future. You know, you got the election in less than a month. What is the biggest issue on your mind going into the election, and then if you were elected, going into 2021?
Well, I think the biggest issue for me is really making sure that the government priorities are reflecting what government should be doing. And you know, we have some statutory requirements, that being education. We have transportation obligations, you know, for the actual physical infrastructure of the state. We need to make sure that we're taking care of the obligations that we are required to do before we move on to other interests. So to me, the priority of making people whole, particularly in the healthcare industry, where they're providing services, there is reimbursement from the state for Medicaid because they're not able to pay for the services that are provided. The state, if you're going to provide that program, you need to make sure that the providers are being reimbursed at the rates that does reflect what their true costs are. And in the case of education, we have over 52% of our budget goes to education. That's been court mandated. We need to make sure that the schools have what they need, the flexibility to, particularly in some of the rural schools. And in some of the rural schools where they don't really have a tax base and they're limited as to what they can actually generate from their own local levies, we need to make sure that they're not falling behind. That if we're talking about equal education for everyone throughout the state, we need to be addressing that, making sure that actually is taking place. From a transportation's perspective, I mentioned that it needs to be across the state. Everyone uses it, and what we've done, we are continually falling behind because we are deferring maintenance. We're not even reaching preservation levels to preserve what we have, and we have a lot of people moving into the state. There are greater demands, so we're going to have to make even more changes to the systems that we have. So those are real definite challenges for the state. And they're not easily solved, but I think those are the things that we have to look carefully at. As I say, making sure that the things that we're statutorily required to provide, that those things are adequately funded, and that includes some of those social safety net programs that we have in place.
All right. Well, best of luck confronting those issues until the election, and I hope hope everything goes well, and best of luck in your the election and your future endeavors, of course.
Thank you, Xavier. Nice to meet you, and enjoyed the visit.